Hello and welcome back to A Shark's Perspective. So we hear often on Shark Tank the term licensing deals. Damon, John, and Mr. Wonderful mention them a lot. And having dabbled just a bit in this space years ago, I find licensing to be very misunderstood by a lot of marketers, especially senior level ones. But when you think about that brand value and equity that you build in a brand, that trust, then where and when should you take a logo and stick it on a licensed product that maintains the integrity of your brand as well as the quality, makes your company richer, and helps the extension of how consumers see your brand in another way? Jeff Lotman is the CEO and founder of Global Icons, a brand licensing agency, and he's also the author of the new book, Invisible Marketing, a hidden tool for connecting with consumers through licensing. And on this episode, we'll discuss licensing, collaboration, California Pizza Kitchens, CPG, private labels like Kirkland's and A Great Value, the pitfalls to avoid, Bogey and Cagney, the Three Stooges, corn dogs, a Caterpillar cell phone, steak cuts, and a lot more. So let's tune in to a licensing expert with a global icon shark on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today on A Shark's Perspective. If you would, tell us a little bit about your background and your career to date.
Sure. So I started Global Icons almost 25 years ago. And specifically, we originally started in what was called the dead celebrity space. So I used to represent Hollywood icons, which I really loved, like people like Cagney and Dietrich and Gable and Lombard and W.C. Fields, so on and so forth. And I went ahead, and where that business was really, really great, because at the time it was very based on a collectible business. So you'd sell a lot of collectible plates and so on and so forth. Well, eBay basically destroyed that entire business because it became the great equalizer. Before that, there was books that would say, well, if you bought this plate or if you bought this Franklin Mint object, it would go up every year. And it was sort of this not based on a real marketplace. Mm-hmm. But once all of a sudden everybody had all these things in their closet, they're like, oh my God, let's try to sell it. Of course, prices came down. Nobody really wanted that Three Stooges plate anymore. And that whole area really fell apart. So we realized that the collectible business was going away. And literally on a Friday, as I call it, I buried all my clients. I buried the dead, so to speak, and moved into brand licensing. I've always been a brand guy. I came out of the food space before I started this company, working with people like McDonald's and Kraft and others. And I always loved brands. And licensing itself is a $130 billion a year industry. Dead celebrity licensing is about $400 million a year, and brands is $60 billion. So I figured it was better to be a smaller fish in a big pond than it was to be a huge fish in a very small pond.
Absolutely.
So that's what happened.
Well, now I'm fascinated. What were the biggest celebrity names that you worked with, or I guess they were dead to you anyway, literally and figuratively. But what were the biggest names you sort of worked on material for?
Sure. Well, Three Stooges was a really big client. I mean, they did at the time. It was a very big portfolio. But the biggest client that we had was Humphrey Bogart, and the reason it was so big, besides also my personal favorite, Bogey and Cagney were my first. Cagney was my first client. It's a whole story unto itself. But we did a deal with Thomasville Furniture, and there was the Bogart collection of furniture.
Oh, wow.
And at the time when they finally stopped it, we were doing $100 million a year in furniture. $100 million a year in retail sales of furniture. Only Hemingway at the time was bigger.
Yeah.
I think they were doing like $200 million before Thomasville. Unfortunately, the whole company started collapsing. But it was they were clearly at the time the biggest. And I still represent the Hollywood sign on the Walk of Fame. They're my oldest client. Been doing it now for 20 years. So every time you see the Hollywood sign on the Walk of Fame on a commercial or a film, they write the chamber and me a check. So it's pretty wonderful.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, excited about your new book, Invisible Marketing, a hidden tool for connecting with consumers through licensing. So, many people hear about licensing just on Shark Tank. For, the general public, that's probably when Damon John brings it up and says it's a licensing deal.
I love it. Yeah.
That he's really for a lot of people, that's the most education they're going to get in licensing. So help define real quickly what licensing is and what it's not.
Sure. So to begin with, it's the most misunderstood field there is. As a matter of fact, it's the most frustrating thing. If people say to me, what do you do? I don't tell them I'm in licensing because it takes too much of an explanation. I just say I'm in marketing. And it would be easier if I could say I'm a doctor or a banker or a dentist or something like that. But it doesn't work that way. And so licensing in its simplest form is you have brand owners that control intellectual property, usually their logos or brand itself. And then you have manufacturers that are trying to gain shelf space in a market. And you could take a brand new product and say, I really want to create a new microphone. I could call it Jeff, or I could call it Sanyo or Panasonic or Lamborghini or something like that. And any one of those brand owners, you'd have to pay a royalty on sales for the use of their IP. And we, as the broker in between, negotiate the deal between the brand owner and the manufacturer.
So, also help explain the difference before we dive in deeper into licensing, what a brand collaboration deal is versus brand licensing. I know that was something you talked about later in the book, but kind of define that now, if you will.
Sure. Well, brand collaborations are, and a lot of times, are licensing. But at the same time, at the simplest form, it started off where you had a brand that was very well known in one space that really wanted to have one that could then lift itself up. So, for example, I think a great one is John Varvatos. You familiar with him as a fashion
Yeah.
brand?
Oh, yeah.
When he did the deal with Converse, which at the time was very much a brand collaboration, and that at the time Converse was doing okay, and John Varvatos honestly was not well known to a larger audience. Well, that raised John's awareness up so significantly because all of a sudden, he created a great friggin' sneaker that, of course, sold a lot, but it really raised his awareness, and that really was an example of a really great brand collaboration. So there's a lot of cool stuff that are out there that are done like that are collaborations. But a lot of times collaborations do have a licensing component where money's actually also given.
So we always look for opportunities in how this use case fits for our product or service, but help explain when something is not good for a licensing deal.
Sure. Well, to begin with, manufacturers want to sell stuff. At the end of the day, that's what they really want to do. And they really want to find an audience. And the beauty of licensing is it helps you find that audience because if that audience connects deeply with your product, it's really going to help sell. What happens is sometimes when it doesn't. So, for example, one of our clients is Duraflame, which I'm sure you know. They make those wood press logs. They are the market leader. And in licensing, if you can work with the market leader or the first person you think of when you think about that category, you know it's going to really work. So, for example, they have these things called sterno cans, and they go under chafing dishes. So you see them all the time at parties or at people's homes where they put these lit little cans underneath a tinfoil container, and it keeps the food hot. So I would think that Duraflame would make sense because obviously it means heat and it means consistency. And for some reason, it just didn't work. Consumers didn't see it because in their mind, Duraflame was more logs and not necessarily, and they knew that you couldn't cook on a Duraflame log. They make that very obvious. So I think because they knew you couldn't cook on it, the idea that even though it was providing heat, it just didn't seem to make sense and the product didn't work. That's an example of just a disconnect. The same way that Zippo actually did, which I think is so funny. Zippo actually did a perfume, which is like, so you want to smell from lighter fluid? What's the connection? But it's funny. In Europe, it did really well. So sometimes it also depends where you're selling it to and what customer it really works.
Interesting. Yeah.
Really
it's not a good way of telling a girl she smells hot. So one of the examples you bring up is California
I'm
Pizza.
Steal that.
Yeah, you feel free. So one of the examples you bring up is California Pizza Kitchen, place I've eaten at many times. Unpack the example of how they've done that today, how they've done licensing.
Well, the part that's incredible, they were one of the leaders in the whole space of bringing a restaurant brand to a supermarket. And there was a lot of nervousness because if you think about it, if you're a franchise owner, so you own a bunch of retail stores, or you're the franchisee, meaning you paid money to use that brand, how are you going to feel about the fact they're selling a competitive product in a supermarket? You would think that it's really going to pull away sales and it's not going to be good for you. Actually, the opposite is true because when you go shopping in a supermarket, your head is in one thing. What do I want to eat? What am I buying? What am I putting away? And you're not necessarily buying to eat at this moment. You're usually buying to eat over the next week or so. So when you go to a restaurant, you're like, where are we going out to eat tonight, honey? Oh, I really want to go eat this. It's a very different buying decision. And if anything, what they found was that it really got people to see the brand in another way because, look, they know a frozen pizza can only be so good. But the great thing is the California Pizza Kitchen was at the time the best frozen pizza there was because before then, frozen pizza was like kind of Frisbees with food on it. It wasn't all that great. But you didn't care because you knew what it was. Okay, let's have a frozen pizza. Okay, you put it in the oven. It tastes like a frozen pizza. But because they added some really cool gourmet flavors, which at the time was not done, like barbecue chicken pizza, so on and so forth, it really broke out that category. And it really was very successful. So much so that the licensor, the company that actually, so the licensee, the company that actually was the manufacturer, which was Nestle, actually held the rights to make that pizza, bought those rights out from California Pizza Kitchen. So now no more money is being paid to California Pizza Kitchen because it was doing so well that they're like, we don't want to pay you any more money. Same thing happened with the George Foreman Grill. I mean, George sold that right to that specific category, and received, a big check as it's only fair because he did a great job and the name really resonated with that.
And it may be less revenue, but it's a whole lot less headache for somebody to deal with, which shows the advantage. But I think the interesting value that when you think about just pizzas alone, I know those ones that maybe didn't taste as good that I had on those cheaper
And me.
college nights, a Totino's brand, I think that was the name of it, wasn't as elaborate a pizza, if you will, as California Pizza Kitchen. And I'm sure they probably started from one store somewhere, but California Pizza Kitchen, I used to eat at those all the time on the road. And so I went to a restaurant or went to a store, I remember just last year, and thought, I'm too tired to go out. Love to go get one, but why not just for a little bit less, you get the same thing. So there's really a value to them. But while licensed, it is still their recipe, right? With most of those kind of examples.
It is. Oh, it is. They control the packaging. When you're the brand owner and you do a deal, you control every aspect of that deal. You control the packaging, you control the product, you can't control pricing because that becomes
Sure.
Obviously an issue of any competition. But you can control retail channels. So in the case of pizza, it's sold everywhere. It's not really a big deal. But in the case of, let's say, you're selling a T-shirt, that if you want it to be sold, you can't say I want it to be sold at $100, but you can say I only want it to be sold at Nordstrom and above, or I want it to be in Bloomingdale's or Macy's or Target. So you basically control pricing by channels of distribution, and that's how you pretty much control. But you control everything, and if the product isn't right, you can make them stop shipping it. I mean, there's all these things that are part of that contract.
So you would still control the co-packer of sorts, and you would tell them
yes.
whether or not they could put it in Kroger or Safeway, for example.
Well, yes, that would have been as part of the contract negotiation.
Sure, right.
That
Well,
we're allowed
true.
to sell to Kroger, Safeway, but you couldn't maybe sell to Vaughn's if maybe
Right,
there was a
right.
problem and people thought that Vaughn's was not the quality. And I'm not knocking Vaughn's; it's only by an example.
No,
They're
sure,
good,
sure.
Good retail.
So I like that you talk about the mistakes people make in the licensing game. You brought up one in particular that about Duraflame, which we mentioned earlier. Talk a little bit about that example and then some of the pitfalls that a lot of licensors can learn to avoid when doing this. Because it seems very easy to take most examples, product or service, and make it licensing. But there, obviously, as you elaborate well, there are a lot of mistakes that have happened.
There are a lot of mistakes, and what you find, especially with companies that just do this, is that what happens is the phone will ring, and they'll be like, "Hey, I really want to use your product on X." They're like, "Oh, it sounds pretty cool," and I really want to pay you this. They're like, "Oh, it sounds fair," and then the deal's done by their attorney, who, no offense, isn't a licensing attorney and doesn't understand the specifics and all the performance outs that needs to be built in to protect you as the licensor, to make sure that you can make sure that if the deal doesn't work, you can get out of it. There was a company, Mrs. Fields, who actually licensed out their names to chocolates, and they never could get rid of that deal. I mean, the deal was, they made a perpetual deal, and you're like, oh, come on, people don't do that. Well, I can't name it because it's a client of mine, but they also have a perpetual deal. So people do this kind of stuff. They're not really thinking about it, and that really can hurt you. It's just not really understanding all the ways to really protect yourself.
You remind us about understanding your core business in DNA and why licensing may be good or not good for the business. Elaborate on that, please, because I don't want people to just think you're just going to be able to take whatever your brand logo or sticker is and slap it on whatever you want.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a really good question. We talk about concentric circles, and it's a fancy word that basically means stick to your knitting. So who is the customer that really makes sense for your product? I mean, who are they? What are they eating specifically? And then what can you also sell them, that same customer, that will then satisfy other needs? And there's two reasons for that. One is you also want to protect yourself from competition. And so by putting your name on more things that do make sense will then create more shelf space, which then give you more presence. Or what's really cool is in the case of, let's say, California Pizza Kitchen, if you're being sold in the frozen aisle, if all of a sudden you do a refrigerated take-at-home pizza, you're now seeing your brand in two different parts of the supermarket. And how great is that? So it also puts channel as a different way and a different area to find your product.
So if you're licensing your product or even service, how do you advise brands on helping them keep control of that message tied to their brand? Sometimes it may make monetary sense as just another path to make money, but also it might hurt them from, say, a brand reputation standpoint.
It can, honestly, one of the biggest things that matter is partner selection, because you really need to have someone that's going to be there and perform for you. And you don't want someone who's just basically trying to build their company on your back, because that can get really scary. You really want someone that's proven. We find that people that are currently the private label guy at a Kroger or a Kirkland, like it's President's Choice at Kroger, or Kirkland, and obviously at Costco,
And members
to
market
have those
Sam's.
opportunities. Right, exactly. And those people have been proven. They can deliver, they can make a quality product. They clearly have been vetted by that supermarket a long time before that happens. The problem, of course, is if I come in and I'm going to sell that same jar of relish for 30 cents less a jar, you're probably gone. But if you license Vlasic, for example, for relish, the chance of them throwing you out is nil, because people are going to come looking for it. And that's really where it makes a lot of sense. That's why for us, we tend to look for private label people as a first source, specifically in the food space, because it's great because you already know they can really do it. And the challenge is, as you said, is you got to really protect yourself, because the last thing you want is for someone to ruin your brand. And honestly, when you build the right controls in, you can make sure that happens. You make sure it's been tested right. You make sure the quality's right. You make sure the safety standards are right. All these things have to be done before the product goes to market.
Well, and one of the biggest brands that nobody ever thinks about, but it's one of the biggest worldwide, is a Great Value. Walmart's distribution brand for all their private label stuff, and you think of the sheer footprint of them and how much they sell. It's crazy how many of those products. Funny story, I did a contract job for a meat co-packer. Went to their facility one time, saw 50 different types of corn dogs all being made at the same place. Different recipes with different batters, but for the most part,
the
corn dog or sausage making process was all the same. And it was just really interesting to first get my eyeballs on how that entire journey for licensing happens. But one of the stories that I understood that you talk about, but I struggled with, was the story of Kenny Boper. I believe that was how you pronounce his name, at Caterpillar, and how they were looking at various product lines because they believed that that distinguishing trait of their customer was that all Caterpillar customers wanted to succeed in their job. And that seemed a bit broad to me. I mean, it could be applied to most any customer, but help refine that, if you will, a little bit about how a Caterpillar, for example, can take a product that you normally think of in the tractor farmer type conversation applies to so many other different types of products and services they have.
Sure. Well, when you think about it, as you said, people that work at Caterpillar, their equipment itself are making a significant difference between moving equipment or plowing equipment or so on and so forth. And Caterpillar is very much about stability and durability and the fact it's going to work. So when they then look at what products can they then support the people that use that, they want to make sure those are the same built in. That's why the Caterpillar boot has been something that's been a huge success, and they've done for a long, long time, and continues to make them an awful lot of money. And then in the example, when they were approached before about a cell phone, at first they're like, I really don't get it. But then they started thinking about it. Well, honestly, people that work on those construction sites, their equipment gets banged up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And why not give them something that really could be the most durable cell phone that could be thrown and dropped, and a crane could hit it and it still would exist. And that's what they've done. And in that market, they've done a great job. You won't see that anywhere, but if you're in that space, you realize that's a great product to have, because you probably ruined a couple cell phones on the job before
exactly. How should we go about targeting then compatible products? One of the things I thought was an interesting example was the turtle wax example. Normally, I don't think about turtle wax and how good it can make the inside of my car smell, but use the example of the turtle wax auto freshener. And so that, just looking at compatible products is an interesting conversation.
Sure, and then the other issue was, and that was a real challenge, because it has the word wax in its name.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's why we've sort of morphed it more towards, buy turtle wax, but really leverage the turtle logo, which is so cool and people really understand. And that sort of soften the word wax, because it's hard when you have a brand whose name includes the product category of what it does, which is great when you're building a brand, but when you want to license it, it can become a little challenging, because everyone's like, wait a minute, turtle wax shampoo, or turtle wax, floor topping.
And on top of just the name, it has a distinct smell when you're waxing your car.
Right.
So how do you go about tackling that?
Very well, again, it's really about in terms of packaging and the way you position the product, and it's done very well. We've done wiper blades, we've done all these car care products and car accessories and floor mats and so on and so forth. It's a really good And we built it as not what they call the OPP, opening price point product. It's just a little bit above it, and that consumers really believe, because turtle wax is a product around for a long time. It's got great history and great believability and great trust, and we're really building off of that. And people, it's done very well. It's a good, everyone's very happy about it. We actually just launched it in South America. We're very excited to see how that
Wow.
goes there.
So you talk about some blasphemy talk early on about not looking at licensing just for the money. But I thought it was really interesting when you talked about how CMOs look at it. What are the types of people that you find that get this idea? And what are the ones that don't get it?
It's amazing to me. First off, nobody wants to say you don't know something.
Oh,
So, I
sure.
mean, I can't tell me, I meet a CMO and I go, do you know what licensing is? Sure, I know
Yeah,
what it is.
yeah.
And I would bet 9 out of 10 times they don't. People think I put a logo on my shirt, or I'm going to slap something on, or someone's going to abuse it, and they don't get it. And honestly, the bigger the company, in one hand, the lesser they get it, because they get very
Oh,
concerned about
absolutely.
sometimes about royalties. They're like, well, how much money are we going to make? And what are you going to make this quarter? What are you going to make next quarter? And we do something that's incredible with licensing in terms of brand licensing, is that in advertising or PR or radio or television, there's that third wall that you can't break through the consumer. And there's all this noise of all these other ads that are trying to get to you. But when we create a product and we do a deal and you bring it home and you eat it or you wear it or you let your kids play with it, you have this deep relationship with that customer that you can't get any other way. And we're able to provide it. And honestly, the biggest challenge we have in our industry, there is no great measurement. There is no ability to really measure, like, what's the value of having a 3 foot space of wiper blades with turtle wax, with the turtle wax brand. And we try to do things like that. And we've actually meet with Nielsen's, and we met with some of the top research firms, and nobody can really find a way that makes sense. You think about sponsorship as an example. Sponsorship's also a bit airy fairy. Like, what's it worth when they do the Comerica football stadium or something? What's that really worth? But there are ways that calculate that people trust. You would think that, and if you walk in the supermarket, there's something called a shelf topper, which they put above a product.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that has a value to it. So you would think if a shelf topper is worth that, to have a whole space to be worth similar, the money becomes so crazy that doesn't really make sense. And it's a real frustration, because honestly, what we do is awareness build, and that's what we do. And we really get new customers, and we connect with new customers. And in a certain sense, honestly, the money that's made, they should let us keep it, truly, because they're spending all this money on advertising, and what kind of return they're getting. Where with us, we know what's going on, and the money that is being made, it's nice money, but the larger the brand, it really comes down to, and it should be focused on, awareness. Ford understood that. They really understood the value of the customer. They understood the experience of the customer. They wanted to make sure their products had to be made right, because they could not have a product that would possibly then affect the Ford brand of durability and stability. And they realized that, or to make products that then had those qualities was beneficial to them.
Well, if I'm a business leader inside my organization, where do I start thinking about this and applying it to my own business, and start thinking out loud with where we can leverage this to grow?
Well, honestly, this is really where an agency can really benefit you, because we can come in and we can do a strategy. And even though you may decide that you don't want to implement that strategy, we can come in and help you do the thinking and try to really figure out, like, where your brand can grow, where it can go to, what categories. And usually we also have a list that's much greater than we'd ever really want to implement, but it really gets the thinking going. And from at that point, they can really understand what's the size of the market, what's the potential, where can it go, where can we fight off other competition, where you are against competition. So it's to do that strategy, and it lets them help them do that thinking. And from there, they can make a decision on whether or not they should actually do licensing or not.
Perfect. Well, Jeff, you're in LA, a place that I've done diving. The water is too cold, but you see a lot of juvenile great whites out there. I asked every guest that's been on a shark's perspective, what is your favorite kind of shark and why?
I'm a great white guy. I think if you're going to be a shark, you should be like the king of the sharks. It's always
Agreed.
like, if you're going to be out there, go for it.
Agreed. Well, Jeff, it's a special time of the show. Are you ready for the 5 most interesting and important questions that you're going to be asked today?
Oh, here it goes. All right, size 11 and a half. Now
Yeah.
go.
Number 1, you talked about the Three Stooges earlier, and it would be too easy to give you this choice with Curly, so I'm going to ask you, Larry or Moe?
Oh, there's no two ways about it. It's definitely Larry.
All right. Number 2, California Pizza Kitchen question, the original barbecue chicken pizza or the mushroom pepperoni sausage?
that barbecue chicken, that was my thing. I still love that. I even like the barbecue chicken salad that they have, which is the same thing without the meat
How
stuff
funny.
when I'm trying to be healthier.
All right, number 3, Humphrey Bogart or James Cagney?
That's really hard because
Sophie's choice for you.
Cagney was my first client. And actually, very briefly, when we met with the estate owner, we were trying to get the rights to specifically do an animated project. And she's like, look, I'll give you the rights to the animated project only if you also represent me. And I'm like, okay.
Okay, yeah.
And Global Icons was born because she made me do it. Marge made me represent her. And so even though I'm a huge Bogey fan and I'm a good friend with Stephen Bogart, who's the son, and to this day, he's a great guy and I'm a huge Bogey fan. But for me, it's hard because if it wasn't for Cagney, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation.
How funny. Number 4. You come from a family of butchers, or at least one. I read it in the book.
Yeah, grandfather and father, yes.
Yeah. The New York strip or the filet mignon?
Oh, there's no question. No question. New York strip. I'm sorry. I find the filet a little too mushy. I'm a big New York strip guy, and I've been enjoying. I also really like those giant T-bones that I finally learned how to cook a 30-ounce T-bone. That was an interesting process, and it takes a long time, but when it's done right, and of course it's great when you serve this giant brontosaurus-sized piece of meat.
Right.
It's it's great.
All right, number 5, and the most important question that you're going to be asked today is biscuits or cornbread?
Oh, cornbread. No two ways about it. I'm a big cornbread fan.
Good man.
That's been my. I like cornbread. I'm a ribs guy, and ribs and cornbread are a big part of the combination. And oh my God, that's sort of like you can't have one without the other.
So, Jeff, excited about the book, but tell us where the people can find out more about you, about invisible marketing, keep up with what you're doing and more.
Sure. Well, it's going to be available on Amazon. I think actually tomorrow it goes for sale. And you can find it there. And of course, or you can find us at Global Icons, which is the name of the company, and globalicons.com. And of course, I'm on LinkedIn a lot. So I post a lot. And of course, when the book comes out, you'll be seeing a bunch of stuff that comes out supporting the book, as you can imagine. That'll be coming out soon, too.
Jeff, thank you so much for being with us today on A Shark's Perspective.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
So there was my conversation with Jeff Lotman, the CEO and founder of Global Icons, a brand licensing agency, and he's also the author of Invisible Marketing, a hidden tool for connecting with consumers through licensing. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from my conversation with him. First, one of my favorite examples in this whole conversation is that of California Pizza Kitchen. So normally, a lot of folks would think that licensing out a frozen pizza at a supermarket might cannibalize their in-restaurant traffic. They've got restaurants all over the country. However, as he points out, it's proven that it does not. It's a different buying decision and even helps people further connect with the brand. And when you think about it, if you went into a grocery store to buy food and you decided to buy a frozen pizza to take home, then that doesn't make you automatically say, good, now I don't have to go to a restaurant. Your intent is different. With these kind of opportunities, it simply helps people to see your brand in another way. Second, those pitfalls can be tough to figure out, but it really becomes like anything else, learning if that audience, your customers, connect deeply with your brand. But you've got to figure that out. Just as he explained, an obvious example that didn't work for him was Duraflame, but one that wasn't so obvious, it was very different, in fact, made sense with Turtle Wax. In this case, this is where you really have to think about the packaging and the nuance that you'll have to make. Third, to me, licensing, for lack of a better phrase, is simply building off of trust. It's that 5-letter word that you should write in all caps when you start speaking of your brand. If you've truly built that trust with your customers, then you might find a good opportunity to extend your brand here, potentially with a licensing deal. Got a question? Send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. I really wish that I explained to you how bullish I am on the future. So please join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.